Hello and welcome to week 3 in behavior modification. And after spending a week looking at classical conditioning, we are going to now switch to operant conditioning, which is going to pretty much dominate everything from this point on in the course. Now, operant conditioning, remember, conditioning, learning, can use those interchangeably. The first sort of clear evidence of the movement we now know of as behaviorism came from Edward Thorndike. Now, Thorndike proposed kind of a theory, and it's one of those that when we look at it retrospectively, it seems like, well, of course, why do we need a theory like that? But you have to understand that this is coming from a scientific point of view, and it's an observation supported by data, not just personal observation or anecdotal work. And I'm going to read the quote because I really like the way Thorndike describes these factors in such a generic way that it really tells us a lot about how applicable behaviorism is going to become later on. So he says, if an association is followed by a, quote, satisfying state of affairs, it will be strengthened. And if it is followed by a, quote, annoying state of affairs, it will be weakened. Now, let's use the word association within this definition the way we learned about classical conditioning last week, learning by association. When two things occur, and because those two things occur, it brings about a positive state of affairs. Those two things are the behavior and the consequence. He separates out right at this beginning, separates out that the consequence is not necessarily a positive or negative state of affairs. And we will see how important that is when we start looking at the development of reinforcements and punishments. So he says, when these things two occur, when I do this and this happens, there's a consequence, and the result is a positive state of affairs. I mean, my perception of the situation is I'm better off now for doing that. He considers that the first half of our law. The second half is if that association between an action and a consequence leads to a negative or annoying, love that word, annoying state of affairs, then that will be weakened. So those associations become stronger and weaker. This is taking that original idea of learning by association and blending it into this new quote unquote law of psychology. There are not a lot of laws within psychology. Within biology, physics, all of those other sciences, there are lots of laws, the ways in which things happen all the time. It is not very often that we come across a law within psychology, because the standard answer to any sort of question in psychology is usually it kind of depends on a whole lot of factors, right? So, except when we come to behaviorism, and here we have this proposition that there's actually a law associated with this. Now, keep in mind that I'm teaching positive psychology right now, and we're talking about the humanist movement as a response to both the deterministic aspect of psychoanalytic theory and the deterministic aspect of behaviorism later on. Behaviorism was also a reaction to psychodynamics. Psychodynamics, which posits that the mechanism of behavior lies within unconscious motives being taken on by the id, the superego, and the ego. the behaviorists were like, you know what? I can't open up the brain and see the id, ego, and superego. So we're just not going to concern ourselves with what's going on in the brain. All we're going to worry about is inputs and outputs. Things happen, something happens that we're not worried about in the brain, and something happens after. If we can understand the before and the after relationship, there is no need to understand what's going on inside of the brain. Behavior becomes predictable, which is the goal of psychology, one of the goals of psychology. So it's important to recognize that this field also introduced a departure from trying to figure out how the brain works. The black box theory was that the brain exists within an impenetrable, completely ununderstandable reality. Let's not worry about it. Let's just worry about what we're going to call antecedents and consequences. Another researcher, James Watson, comes along and he terms the idea of behaviorism. He's famous for the little Albert case where he conditioned a small child to be afraid of rats. Now, his observation was that the conditioning of, if you ever watched you can actually see it on film, it's somewhat abusive. Exposes the child to a rat, and as a child, they're not afraid of the rat. Now, these are pet rats, so the playing with the rat and whatnot. And then in other trials, he exposes the child to the rat, and he takes like a metal bar and he clangs them together, and it startles the infant. And soon there's an association between the rat and the sound, and soon whenever the child experiences the rat, they experience that same fear. They basically created a phobia. And we called it a phobia because not only was that child afraid of rats, it was afraid of anything that was white and furry. So any cloth or a blanket or anything like that that had that quality. So the fear generalized to other areas. So he was basically studying phobias. He then reconditioned the same child to be not afraid by disassociating, exposing the child repeatedly to the white rat until they became used to it, and soon they weren't afraid of them again. And then, in true ABAB scientific design, he reintroduces the fear quality and leaves little Albert afraid of white things. Now, at that point, this is when the history of psychology gets all weird. It just so happens that James Watson was having an affair with the mom. They broke it off. She was worried about what he was doing to her child, and she took him out of the experiment and left. Now, it's always been a curious, it's one that has been solved. Little Albert has been found. You can look that up. But this person sort of disappeared from the world of psychology before Watson could make him not afraid anymore. So he remained somewhat timid about white furry things. So just so a little story in the history of psychology here. But then along comes a researcher from Harvard University by the name of B.F. Skinner, and he introduces what we now know of as behavior modification, or applied behavior analysis, really getting into the science, the deep science of how we manipulate antecedents and consequences. That is largely what this class is going to be about. He introduced the concept of the ABC contingency theory, meaning it's called operant conditioning because the antecedents, that which happens before the behavior, may be cues or triggers the behavior, and the consequences, rewards, punishments, however that is, operate on the behavior. They affect the behavior. So under certain circumstances, we may choose from our fund of behaviors. The antecedent elicits a particular behavior that we pick because we're under those particular circumstances, and also because we've associated those behaviors with positive, negative outcomes, state of affairs after we've done those behaviors. So that ABC contingency theory becomes an excellent, in my opinion, the perfect model for meeting all of the different goals of psychology. And I emphasize this numerous times throughout my classes. So if we look at the goals of psychology is to describe, explain, predict, and control behavior, then the ABC contingency theory can do all four. It can describe behavior, it can explain behavior, A's and C's, it can be used to predict behavior, and ultimately we can manage the A's and C's in order to bring about changes in the behavior. So we'll be looking at that throughout this class. What I'm going to be asking for you to do, and let me talk about the assignment first because it leads from what I just said. The assignment, I'm asking you to come up with 3 behaviors that exist within your life right now, and I want you to describe the A's and C's that maintain that behavior. I don't want you to describe a behavior plan that you're on where you have manipulated the A's and you're manipulating the C's. Let's say you're on a weightlifting program and you set yourself up with a goal every week. I'm going to lift weights twice. If I do that, I get to watch my rerun of Seinfeld. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a purely descriptive aspect of your life. But then you sit back a little bit and you can see the A's and C's that exist within the natural world. And you get a sense of this notion of the ABC contingency theory being an extremely adaptive theory for the descriptive goal of psychology and human behavior. Now, back up a little bit, we look at the discussion. What I'm asking you to talk about is life stories or things that you've heard, either personal or from other people, about the ways in which parents manage the A's and C's in order to bring about change in their behavior. Some of this comes natural. Some of this we learn from our parents. Some of this is extremely positive, and some of this is abuse. All of which falls under the efforts of parents to manage the A's and C's intuitively to bring about changes in their children's behavior. Discussing those things. They don't have to be negative. This doesn't have to be a reflection of personal trauma. That is totally up to you. And you don't have to share those kinds of extreme examples of these things. You can, and that's fine. But almost everything in our life can be described with this. In fact, put to a stretch, you could probably describe almost everything. You could probably describe it. As I'm saying that, I'm like, I don't want to use the word everything. How do dreams fit into the ABC contingency theory? Like the dreams I have at night. Maybe there's some areas that are outside of this, but there's a lot that you can use, just everyday sort of things, and describe those behaviors using the ABC contingency theory. So make sure you understand through your reading and external research what is meant by an antecedent, what is meant by a behavior, and what is meant by a consequence. This is the foundational knowledge that you will need moving into the rest of the course, where we will be discussing the science behind all of that and how to use those tools most effectively to bring about changes in ourselves and others. So that's our lecture for this week. That's our chapter 3, discussing an assignment. Have a great week. As I'm recording this, it's Monday morning and it's a beautiful, beautiful week out. Beautiful day out, sorry. It looks like it's going to be a beautiful week. Enjoy some outdoors. Enjoy some summer. Don't spend your whole time doing homework, really. So have a great week, and I will see you online. Take care.